Please be seated. I'd like to start. Please be seated.
Good. Well, we're here.
Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me in the back? No? Jenny? I don't think they hear me in the back. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay. So please be seated. We would like to start. Welcome and good morning to you all. My name is Yoram Peri, and I'm the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies. And I'm delighted, honored, and even thrilled to open this conference to celebrate with you Walter Laqueur's 90th birthday and to look at his immense intellectual and academic contributions throughout an entire turbulent century. Two main themes envelope Walter Laqueur's life: love for Europe and an embedded love for the past and modern Jewish history, as it is portrayed in the Zionist movement and the modern state of Israel. After fleeing from his hometown, Breslau, which he was not to visit again until a fine summer evening in the early 1960s, he was faced with the fact that the city he had known and loved was not there anymore. And he found both European and Jewish parallels. He wrote, "It disappeared like Pompeii, or, as some might prefer, like Sodom and Gomorrah." Contributions to these two themes of Europe history and modern Judaism awarded him world acclaim as one of the most distinguished historians and political observers of the 20th century. Isaiah Berlin, whom I had the honor of knowing and befriending in the 70s while studying in London, gave us an elegant distinction between the hedgehog and the fox, which I'm sure all of you know. Hedgehogs, wrote Sir Isaiah, view the world through the lens of a single defining idea. Using Berlin's examples, he included Plato, Dante, Hegel, Nietzsche, and others. Foxes draw a wide variety of experience. For them, the world cannot be boiled down to a single idea. They included Aristotle, Shakespeare, Molière, Goethe, Joyce, and others. Tolstoy's talents are those of a fox, though he himself argued that one ought to be a hedgehog. And indeed, our Walter is in that caliber. His talents are those of a fox, but he uses history like a hedgehog. Walters is a person who knows many things, but concentrates and scrutinizes them through the prism of history in a detailed analysis. He writes on one hand about Stalin, Weimar, guerrilla, Zionism, or the Middle East, and on the other, he lets us peep into his personal life through his biographies. More than one. Berlin himself said that he never meant his fox-hedgehog distinction very seriously. "I meant it as a kind of enjoyable intellectual game," he said, "but it was taken seriously. We take Walter's multifaceted abilities very seriously." And there is another idea of thought that I can recall. Berlin wrote about ideas, thoughts, and movements, but described them thoroughly in a mundane, or through mundane, daily, simple stories about people. Indeed, he did not shy away from gossip. So is Walter. With his extraordinary memory, he tells stories about people and events with full details. For him, a lofty theory and a good gossip are both equal means to acquire better acknowledgement, better knowledge about the human condition. I know that today we will be lucky enough to acquire various aspects of his knowledge and sparks of his interests, and and a glimpse of his very full life and enjoy his fascinating personality and company. Happy birthday, Walter. Before we start, I would like to call upon another historian of modern German history, Professor James Harris, who is the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, to deliver us his welcoming remarks. Jim, please.
Thank you, Yoram, and I'm very happy to be here today. I wouldn't miss an icon like Walter. Does it feel good to be an icon to a one always wonders. 1938 was a good year to leave Germany if you were a Jew, and he did at age 16. And I have some affinity to where he came from, Breslau, because my first book was on Edward Laqueur, who of course was a native of Breslau, now Oklaw, if I'm pronouncing it halfway accurately. And it has changed enormously. There's no question about it. But then it had to, because of all the changes that were introduced for good and evil, mostly evil for a number of years, in the years after 1938. And then I went to the University of Wisconsin when I did that work and worked with Ted Hammerall, my advisor, but also with George Mossy. And for a while there, one could not really say Mossy without saying Laqueur for a number of works, and I wanted to refresh my memory about that. So I used the web and pulled off his bibliography. I could read this, but it would take a while and probably shorten the conference. I think it must be 100 works. And I don't know very many academics who have published that much and that well, and in so many different areas, as Yoram mentioned a few minutes ago. It's truly remarkable. And even more remarkable, I think, for somebody who did have far to go. If you read his autobiography, Thursday's Child Has Far to Go, I would prefer being Monday or Tuesday, frankly, but if you read that, you realize he did have far to go, and it wasn't easy, and it was a long trip, and it's not easy to do that and suffer the losses that he suffered along the way, and still recover a positive stance. A positive stance that he's used for a tremendous amount of analysis for not merely the Europe he came from, but the Middle East that he went to, and in many respects the world we all live in. I won't take longer. I just wanted to say how proud I am to have him here today, to have this conference that Yoram has so ably put together in our Gildenhorn Institute, to have really excellent people on the panel, including somebody who shared my memory of Wisconsin, Jeff Herf, and a variety of others here today. So thank you all for coming. I'll be back. I have to leave now for a promotion and tenure committee meeting, and I would rather be here. So thank you very much and have fun.
Hello, I'm Irena Lasota, and I'm going to chair this panel. I wanted to ask the organizer, do they expect the speakers to come here, or they can also, can we have those microphones working? Because some of them may... Okay, okay, so we can, without much ado, we can start. We have a very busy program, very distinguished speakers. Most of them, if not all of them, had worked with Walter Laqueur, had wrote with him, wrote about him, and I think that the introduction by Professor Peri and Professor Harris is enough for me to just pass the word to the first speaker on our panel, and this is Professor Richard Breitman, who is the author of several books and articles on German history, on the United States history, and the Holocaust. He had done extensive research in several countries. He teaches at the American University in DC, and is also the editor of the journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Professor.
Thank you very much, Microphone okay? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yoram Peri, for inviting me, and the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies, and my old neighbor, Jim Harris. Any assessment of Walter Laqueur's contribution to the study of the Holocaust would have to take into account the supervisory work on the Journal of Contemporary History, and also Walter's editing an encyclopedia of the Holocaust. I cannot do that in the time allotted. I can't even read the titles of Walter's books in the time allotted. So call this a selective account of Walter's work as author. When I was young, a very long time ago, I was working with a wise man on a book, and I asked how to organize something, and he answered, if nothing else suggests itself, organize chronologically. So Walter, that is what I have done. In 1980, Walter published The Terrible Secret, which was mostly an analysis of what in Holocaust literature is called bystanders' reaction to the Holocaust. Got at the question of how much they knew when, and this book really was the first to raise the subject of the availability and diffusion of information as an important dimension of the Holocaust. Subsequent research has validated Walter's view that there was plenty of information around, and that the unwillingness to accept or believe information was far more important than limits on the information itself. Of course, government withholding of information assembled from a wide range of sources was also a factor in the lag in public understanding. In 1980, Walter also wrote an article, and it was both the book and the article that hooked me in. The article published in Commentary, The Mysterious Messenger and the Final Solution. I read this. It was a historical mystery, the identity of an anti-Nazi industrialist, which had been hidden and remained secret since 1942. Walter outlined his own effort to identify the industrialist who had leaked the outlines of the Final Solution to Jewish sources in Switzerland. Gerhard Riegner of the World Jewish Congress had confirmed the basic story, but said he had promised the man to keep his identity secret even after the industrialist's death. Walter had learned that the man's name began with S, last name began with S, and ran through various possibilities in the article. Well, this was a challenge I could not let stand. I was overconfident that I could solve the mystery, and ultimately did, but not without months of hard work and a lot of false conclusions. It turned out the man, Edward Schulte, came from Breslau, and Walter had gone to school with one of his sons. And so that brought us together, and we ended up writing the book, Breaking the Silence, which was in part biography and partly a study of Allied reaction to Schulte's warning. The experience of writing a book with Walter is interesting. One throws oneself 100% into the work only to find that Walter has done twice as much or 3 times as much in the same time. In 1992, Walter published a partial memoir, Thursday's Child Has Far to Go, writing of his own experiences, including seeing Adolf Hitler and much of the top Nazi leadership in July 1938, and witnessing enthusiastic German reaction to him. He wrote for the first time about frantic Jewish efforts to find emigration options in the year 1938. 1996, Fascism, Past, Present, and Future. Walter wrote that the confusion, competition, and conflicts beneath Hitler were not on issues of fundamental importance. He was very skeptical of scholarly treatment stressing the limits of Hitler's power. It seemed to be fairly obvious that a single person could not control the whole country in the 20th century. But he wrote, the longer fascist dictatorships lasted, the more they depended upon the leader. In 2001, Generation Exodus, Walter demonstrated that younger Jews in pre-Nazi Germany were generally happy. Their feelings changed gradually in the Nazi years, but thought that they had more time than they did to prepare for new lives. He saw a level of idealism and risk-taking in the younger generation which distinguished them from the older generation. And those characteristics made them open to many different possibilities for emigration. Some, of course, stayed. Some fought in the resistance. Many left, and some of those fought in Allied armies. In 2001, Walter edited the Holocaust Encyclopedia. He also wrote a short introduction to it. This has to be the only Holocaust encyclopedia that labeled the term Holocaust an unfortunate one. He wrote that the search for the exact number of victims was not likely to succeed, that some historiographical debates should not be pursued forever, nor would they be resolved by taking the midpoint between the extremes. He pointed out that most Jewish victims were not able-bodied men with military training, hence the question of why there was not more Jewish resistance was a somewhat misdirected one. In 2006, Walter published The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism. He argued that Hitler's anti-Semitism was one of the most important motivating forces and that his anti-Semitic propaganda fell on fertile soil, not so much because of the history of German anti-Semitism, but more because of the climate in Germany following World War I. In 2009, Walter published The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, writing again about his personal and political experiences. He elaborated, there would not have been a Nazi takeover without Hitler, and by implication also a Holocaust. He argued for the usefulness of the term totalitarian. There was something different about totalitarian regimes. And totalitarianism and fascism did not suffice to explain the Holocaust, but they were useful in connecting a unique event with broader historical currents. So a man who left Germany a day before Kristallnacht could not very well avoid the subject of the Holocaust. It was not Walter's major focus, but he has nonetheless made very great contributions to the subject. Thank you very much.
Professor Breitman, thank you very much for this very profound introduction to one of the topics of Walter Laqueur's themes. And now we will ask Professor Jeffrey Herf to speak about generally also the other topic, the study of anti-Semitism. Professor Jeffrey Herf teaches modern European history here at the University of Maryland. He's also an author of several books, mostly on Nazi propaganda, the Holocaust, Arab world, and intellectual history. Professor Breitman spoke 10 minutes. We allow up to 12 minutes because we would like at the end to have question, answer, and if possibly a discussion. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say happy birthday, Walter, and to say thank you to Yoram Peri. When I suggested that we do an event like this, he was enthusiastic and mobilized the resources of the Gildenhorn Institute to make this possible. So happy birthday to you and thank you to you. I was sitting in the Dallas-Fort Worth airport yesterday afternoon, putting the finishing touches on a beautiful essay that I had written for this morning. And then I got home last night and I printed it out, and I was looking forward to delivering it, and then I opened up my folder and I looked at it, and it's an essay that I wrote a week and a half ago for something completely different. So those of you who have done a lot of public speaking have nightmares about something like this happening, and so I'm going to wing it. But I think I remembered what it was I was going to say today. And I wanted to talk about the book that Richard mentioned. Richard is a very great historian, by the way, Richard Breitman, and the kind of detective work and interpretation that he's done regarding the Holocaust is going to be important for decades to come. As Richard mentioned, and Dean Harris as well, Walter has published many books. The Hollis catalog at Harvard University lists 145 of them. Now, that figure is a little misleading because there are translations, and then there are second and third editions. So an accurate count is probably somewhere only between 70 and 100 books. And the first book that Walter wrote, as far as I know, with anti-Semitism in the title, was The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism, which he published in 2006. And the question, that is a typical Laqueur performance of great synthesis, subtlety, and nuance, and balance. That is a book one can read for succinct summaries of anti-Semitism with a much longer time perspective and references to useful works on the subject and a discussion of the Nazi period and the like. But the question that is captured in the title is there a new anti-Semitism in recent years? And if it is new, what is it? And at the core of that issue was a controversial question, the question of the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And in a striking paragraph, which I would have loved to have read to you, Walter listed a set of criticisms, implicit criticisms of Israel's policies on the West Bank, the status of Israel's Arab citizens, and said the criticism of these policies has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, and that is, however, 25 million people, I think this is the figure that you gave, have died in wars around the globe since 1945, and 8,000 people have died in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And yet, judging from the amount of attention given to that conflict and to criticism of Israel, one would think that those numbers might have been reversed. So why? Why this focus? Well, one reason, and here is Laqueur, who was a major policy participant at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington for many years. Here is Laqueur's awareness of the importance of power and size and numbers in international affairs, and pointed out something that is obvious but important, which is that Israel is very small, and that criticizing this very small and not very powerful country is something that many people can puff themselves up and think they're being very courageous, when in fact it is a little country. And it's much easier to criticize a little country that doesn't have many people than it is to criticize a big country that has a lot of people and perhaps oil as well. So that's one reason. It's easy. But another, And another is that maybe there's something lurking there from the older traditions of anti-Semitism. And The Changing Face is a sober book because most of us who have written about anti-Semitism or the Nazi period, and Walter's generation as well, and Stanley Payne and Günter Louis are here, and James Harris as well, and have written with this confidence that anti-Semitism was was a relic of a defeated, disgraced, and delegitimated past, and that we could go to bed at night confident that these horrendous people and their absurd ideas were part of the distant past. The disturbing aspect of the book, The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism, is that there is a history of anti-Semitism that continued after the defeat of Nazism, and that it remains an infuriating part of one of Walter Laqueur's lifelong concerns, contemporary history. So now to the question of how new. And in the book, Laqueur focused on several sources. One of them was communism and the Soviet Union. And my colleague Michael David Fox is here, and those of you who know the journal Kritika know that he and colleagues of his generation are doing superb work on the Soviet history. Well, Walter was one of the pioneers in this country of the history of the Soviet Union. Helped to found the journal Survey, and he paid attention to the anti-Semitic policies and propaganda of the Soviet Union in the anti-cosmopolitan purges in the 50s and the 60s. The Soviet offensive against Israel. That is one source of what could be called the new anti-Semitism, but then again, it's not very new. And if one wants to be, one could go back and get into a controversy about Marx's essays on the Jewish question. And at any rate, one of the themes of Laqueur's work is this connection between anti-Semitism and the communist tradition. A second theme was the Western left. And here again, the question of how new is the left, the anti-Semitism of the Western left. Walter pointed out that after 1989, the left turned more and more in Europe and in the United States to the Third World. Well, one could argue that that turn to the Third World took place in the 60s, and that Israel was on the wrong side of that turn for many of those advocates. But to keep within my time limits, here's the last point I'd like to raise about is there a new anti-Semitism? And it has everything to do with the war in Iraq. And the ugliness of our debates in this country around 2004, 5, and 6. And he wrote in The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism that the decision to go to war was, of course, not made by Jews, he didn't use the phrase Israel lobby, but not made by a host of neoconservatives. And then in his sort of sardonic, humorous way, he pointed out that people such as Donald Rumsfeld or George Bush didn't know who Leo Strauss was. And that there were some people who were under the impression that Leo Strauss and Jewish neoconservatives had led the United States into the war in Iraq. And Walter hints at this, and I'll draw it out a bit and conclude on this note. What was new in the last decade in this country was that these aspersions and suggestions about the power of the Jews didn't come from the gutter. They didn't come from the extreme right. And they gained their respectability because professors at the University of Chicago and Harvard University published a book called The Israel Lobby. And that respectability and that legitimation to not the extreme kind of genocidal anti-Semitism, but a suggestion that the Jews had too much power and that young boys and girls, American men and women, were dying in Iraq because of what these horrendous neoconservatives had done to our country. That became part of American intellectual life in the New York Review of Books and other places. It didn't come from the gutter. That legitimation and that respectability given to these ideas was not new in the history of American universities. It was there in the 1930s and 40s, but it had gone away in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and it returned. And Walter Laqueur's work for his entire life he's been a barometer and has had a very, very acute awareness of the zeitgeist. And he saw that happening before Mearsheimer and Wald published their book, and before the New York Review of Books published that anti-Semitic caricature of Paul Wolfowitz. He saw it happen. He saw it coming. And that kind of courage and that kind of subtlety and balance and nuance has characterized his career. He is really one of the great intellectuals and scholars of our time, and I'm really glad we could do this event for you, Walter.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Stanley Payne, who is a Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the co-editor of the Journal of Contemporary History. He's the author of approximately 20 books, maybe more, and it's considered one of the most famous modern theorists of fascism, especially of the Spanish fascism. Please, Professor Payne.
Thank you very much for this invitation to participate in this important event. Like Jeff Herf, I looked up the Laqueur bibliography to be sure that I had not left something out when I began to prepare these remarks, but the Wisconsin library had only 124 entries, so apparently a few things were missing. Still, it probably was the record for any single scholar whom I've looked up as a general entry. A very great deal of Walter's work has had to do one way or the other with fascism, but the main studies of fascism were concentrated in the 3 decades 1965 to 1996. And here, however, before beginning to discuss his own work, one has to point out, as Richard Breitman did at the beginning, that so much of his contribution to scholarship has been not merely the very numerous examples of his own research and writing, but his extensive work as editor, since he began as an editor, and then, of course, with the founding of the Journal of Contemporary History in 1966. This has been one of the major journals, and at that time, the only one in English devoted to contemporary European history, particularly to fascism, has always been a leader in publishing new research on fascism. The very first number was entitled International Fascism, later published as a book, so that the JCH has been fundamental from that time down to the present, and Richard Evans and I try to keep the flame alive. To understand the importance of that in the 1960s, you have to look at the history of fascism. Initially in the 1930s, commentary about fascism, though occasionally scholarly and research-oriented, primarily was political. Then in the next generation, after the end of 1945, we went into the phase of monographic research, which was primarily descriptive. It was only when you get down to the 1960s, when there had been about 20 years of historical perspective after the end of the fascist era, we began something that is sometimes called the Fascism Debate, begun by people like Ernst Nolte in Germany, Eugene Weber in the States, and by George Massey and Walter Laqueur. That is the attempt to look at European fascism, not just in terms of the history of National Socialism, but Italy and the other countries that had significant fascist movements, and to try to understand fascism as a movement and an ideology with extensive ramifications. The Journal of Contemporary History was a leader in that from the very beginning, and I think has contributed more to that certainly by far than any other journal. One other thing that Walter did as an editor, which was very important, was the best summary and bringing into full focus of these things in the 1970s with his book Fascism, a Reader's Guide, Analyses, Interpretations, Bibliography. This was published in 1975, a collective work, which he edited, and probably the most important single volume as a contribution to the fascism debate as of that time, because it provided analytic treatments of all the major fascist movements, as well as investigation of their ideology, their economic policies and performance, the various interpretations of fascism. Just to point out a couple of the key works in that volume, the Spanish sociologist Juan Linz, some notes toward a comparative study of fascism in sociological, historical perspective, a fundamental work on the social basis of the movements, which is still cited by the younger scholars, the Israeli political scientist Zev Sternhell, on the origins of fascist ideology in the 1890s, not in 1919. This was really rather revolutionary. And so that gives you at least some idea of the importance of the kinds of things that Walter has edited and brought out to the attention of the broader scholarly community. One of his first notable contributions directly was in the book on Russia and Germany. It appeared in 1965, second edition 1990. Very broad work, but particularly in its pointing out the significance of the Baltic German ideological contribution to the early development of National Socialism. This may be a commonplace in fascist studies now, but when Walter pointed this out in 1965, it was really brought to attention for the first time. His work particularly has, I think, contributed two things to fascist studies. One is to broaden the perspective, the general horizon of this kind of inquiry into areas that have not been dealt with by other scholars. And the other simply is to provide a very lucid empirical analysis, free of the very often distorted theorizing that one gets in fascist studies. One of the ways that he broadened the horizon was in the book that he published in '93 called Black 100, The Rise of the Extreme Right in Russia, which is still the most important book about this phenomenon. It was only partly historical. Russia tends to be left out of fascist studies because, of course, during the main period, the Soviet regime was in power in Russia. That book had several dimensions. It brought together, for example, what there was of pre-fascism in the old Russia and emigre fascism, as well as a study of the neo-fascists and the radical right in Russia in the 1990s. It showed the range of the new Russian radical right was based on bringing together lots of different kinds of evidences at that time in the Russian press, and remains, I think, the best synthetic study of this, though it is now nearly 20 years old, and other things have come out since that time. But as an overall analytic survey, I think it still holds pretty much first place in that field. Then, of course, the key work, which has been alluded to before, the Meisterwerk here, the most important single thing, was the book in 1996, Fascism, subtitle, Past, Present, and the Future. That subtitle also tends to summarize the different dimensions of the Laqueurian opus, in that Walter's work has been devoted especially to contemporary history, but not just to contemporary history as we generally conceive it, also to current history, very recent history, and then beyond that, as a political and cultural analyst, to what is going on at the present time with some capacity for projection into the future as well. The 1996 book, I think you could say, is probably the broadest single book on fascism that has been published. Not the biggest, not the most thorough about the history of fascism, but the broadest single book in its perspective and dimensions, because it dealt with the history of the main movement, but also what was going on at the present time, and finally a look ahead as to what would be not really neo-fascism, but the analog of fascism in the future. In 1996, this would mean the 20th century. So I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes to conclude my remarks. In the treatment of historical fascism, Walter refused to give a single definition, various scholars of fascism have tried to define fascism. This has been very slippery. And of course, fascism is multiform. His position was that something that is so pluriform as fascism and takes such different manifestations in different countries could not really be the subject of a single definition. He dispatched very nicely, within only 2 sentences, what had been the shortest and most widely cited new definition, the one by the British historian Roger Griffin, which is hopelessly reductionist, and he got rid of that very nicely in a very brief 4 lines. The section on history deals with the diversity and multiplicity of movements, points out something very significant, often forgotten by people, that historical fascism could only succeed in countries with democratic political systems. This seems counterintuitive, but in fact was the case. Being a European movement in organized European countries, there was really no other way for a fascist movement to come to power except by political means, by mobilizing itself to manipulate a democratic system. Could not use the communist path to power. There is, of course, also in this book a telling analysis of National Socialism and its historical function. And the first main part of the book concludes by observing that inevitably fascism, like all major topics, will be subject to historicization. Historicization meaning relativization as well. That was already going on in 1996 and has happened more since that time, particularly in Germany, but in some other countries. One of the unique things about the major book was that it's the only significant analysis of historical fascism that deals with the neo-fascist and radical right movements that followed fascism after 1945. Though the author does not make the mistake simply of assuming that neo-fascism is going to repeat directly historical fascism. Obviously, it's going to have to take different forms. Moreover, that section of the book does not exaggerate the significance of what were termed the European neo-fascist movements, because although there was a good deal of excitement about that, when the book came out in 1996, a good deal of it was exaggerated. Walter is also a political and cultural analysis of the contemporary world, as well as an historian. And he's been willing to do kinds of things that most historians are not willing to do. Current history, as it is analyzed into the possibility of future projections, is a very tricky business. And so the standard line that most historians use is that as historians, they are prophets of the past, they can't be responsible for anything else. But the last part of this book is entitled Post-Fascism. And this is a very lucid analysis of not so much of neo-fascism, but of the new analogs emerging, primarily not in Europe, but in other parts of the world, which could play somewhat the same kind of political and historical role as fascism. He saw very clearly 15 years ago that the major problems of the 21st century will not come from a direct copy of a kind of neo-fascism, as from new kinds of what might be called analog movements to fascism, particularly the role of the radical religious movements. There's a section on political religion, and he also uses the term clerical fascism, though he does not use the term Islamofascism. Points out something that has gotten a good deal more attention in the last 15 years since that time, the influence of historical fascism, Nazism, Italian fascism in the Middle East, and the importance of Islamic radicalism. So he says, quote, if radicalization for whatever reason should continue in the Islamic world, the fascist trend will become stronger. He does not see the radical Islamist movements as a new religion, which they are not, but rather a radical ideology based on religious elements. And then he also says, quote, Islamism is today the only major force in the world that foments expansion and violence. Sure, he also includes movements among other religious groups as well, in India, even a little bit in Israel, so it is a very broad treatment, and concludes that what we need, of course, for all of this is a different kind of taxonomy. We have trouble defining fascism, and the range of destructive, radical, violent, and revolutionary movements it includes a very broad taxonomic range. He points out in conclusion that history does not repeat itself. It will take different forms, though it can become almost equally destructive, and hence the importance of the populist movements and of the radical religious movements in the 21st century world. The historical analogy in terms of the seed ground for such things would be simply with insecurity on a broad scale and frustration. The accelerated structural change, certainly something that has only continued more rapidly in the 21st century, being the kind of seed ground that might provide opportunity for new kinds of analog movements to develop. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I appreciate you participating in such a well-deserved tribute.
And our last speaker is Mr. Michael Allen, who is Special Assistant at the National Endowment for Democracy and is the editor of the blog and the e-bulletin Democracy Digest. He has previously taught at several British universities, and he's going to speak about the cultural wars of Walter Laqueur. Please, Michael.
Fascism Reader's Guide really was.
Thank you, Irena, and thank you, Yoram, for the invitation to speak. And happy birthday, Walter. It's a real privilege and honor to speak at such a forum. To be more precise, I've been asked to speak about Walter's contribution to what's been called the Cultural Cold War, or the War of Ideas, principally against Soviet communism and Marxist ideology more generally. But I'll argue that the concern about ideological struggle, about the ideas as a political, as a material force in politics, is a leitmotif that runs throughout Walter's work. I was reminded recently, this last week, Hillary Clinton, in an address to the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, spoke about how the United States was, frankly, being outflanked by China, principally in the Asia-Pacific, but also globally, that the United States was now unable to compete with China's soft power, with the billions of dollars that China has invested in Confucius institutes, in media, and other forms of, I would argue, ideological struggle. And it sent me back to, I had a vague recollection of an article I'd read about this, and it sent me back to an article in Foreign Affairs, in fact, way back in 1994, where a certain analyst cautioned Congress at the time against cutting the US budget for public diplomacy, warned against the abolition of the US Information Agency, advised against attempts to kill off the, quote, small but very effective National Endowment for Democracy, and berated the fact that in the United States, public diplomacy was too often considered what he called the stepchild, the poor relation of foreign policy. The author was, of course, Walter, making the case for what we now call soft power, some 16 years before Harvard's Joseph Nye was sipping tea with Colonel Gaddafi. And I think it's, again, one of the principal themes throughout Walter's work, emphasizing the importance of culture, the importance of ideas as a tool, as a component of an effective foreign policy. Even at the height of the Cold War, Walter had to remind us that, quote, Soviet insistence on the ideological struggle is all too often not taken seriously. Ideological struggle, he said, is not something which concerns the philosophers. It is a synonym for political struggle. And political struggle means power, not only the power of ideas, but also some more tangible things. I think the most telling contribution that Walter made to this war of ideas, to ideology as a component of foreign policy, was his contribution to the Congress for Cultural Freedom. As Walter himself wrote in a review of one of the worst books on the Congress by Francis Stonor Saunders, as he said, you had to be there. The Congress was founded in Berlin in 1950, primarily by a group of former communists, ex-communists, former Marxists, principally people like Arthur Koestler, philosopher Sidney Hook, Franz Borkenau, Ruth Fisher, and Melvin Lasky. The Congress was convened to organize intellectuals and artists to promote and defend Western democratic culture. Not just democratic institutions, but democratic ideas, democratic culture. And as Walter said, you had to be there at the time because this is at a time when the West was very much on the defensive. It's difficult for certainly people of my generation to realize how much the zeitgeist of the time was what I guess we could call philo-Soviet, when many Western intellectuals, certainly many Western opinion formers, what we now call the media, were at best neutral towards Soviet communism, if not openly supportive. This was at a time, 1949, 1950, firstly when the Soviets had established their control over the satellite states in Central and Eastern Europe, and secondly when the Soviets had renewed their ideological offensive, their cultural offensive, which we should remind ourselves began not in 1949 at the start of the Cold War, but in 1921. It was in 1921 when Vladimir Ilyich Lenin summoned a German communist called Willy Munzenberg to Petrograd and gave him a huge sum of money and several bags of Molotov diamonds, we're told by historians, and told to go into the West and set up a range of fronts, set up a network of agents to penetrate Western institutions, which Munzenberg with his associates like Otto Katz did very effectively, penetrating labor unions in Europe, Hollywood studios. And so by 1950, the Soviets had had a 30-year head start on the West in terms of conducting ideological struggle, conducting their own ideological offensive against Western democracy. We'd seen this manifested in the Popular Fronts in the 1930s and so on. So the Congress for Cultural Freedom was very much a belated and frankly a relatively modest response to that, as Walter himself has pointed out in his most recent biography, Best of Times, Worst of Times. The Congress of Cultural Freedom was significant but not profoundly important in the sense that it established a number of influential journals, particularly Der Monat in Germany, which changed, I think, quite profoundly the intellectual climate in post-war Germany. Of course, Encounter, which had a critical impact on transatlantic Anglo-American political discourse, but also journals like Tempo Presente and Preuves and so on. But the key point, again, as Walter points out, is that these were very eclectic journals. There was no really politically monolithic line. In fact, an article that was rejected by Encounter might be published by Tempo Presente or Preuve in the next issue. So again, contrary to the conspiracy theories surrounding the Congress for Cultural Freedom, this was not some kind of covert, politically monolithic press agency that was spinning a particular line. But I think the critical thing about the Congress is it did help to shift the zeitgeist, particularly in the 1950s and early 1960s, in almost a kind of Gramscian, slow sweep through the institutions. And of course, one of the most critical journals in the Congress pantheon was Survey. And in fact, it was the Congress that brought Walter from Israel to London in 1954, I believe, at the suggestion of George Lichtheim, a famous historian and political analyst. Walter had the idea, had the idea to publish a newsletter or a journal on Soviet culture. This was just after Stalin had died, and he felt that it was important to monitor Soviet politics, Soviet cultural developments, and George Lichtheim recommended him to Michael Yosselson, the head of the Congress for Cultural Freedom in Paris. And the journal was really an attempt to not just monitor shifts in Soviet culture, but also to make these shifts and to make the nuances of Soviet politics accessible to non-specialist audiences. I think it was Alan Bullock, the historian, who described Survey as the jewel in the crown of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And Peter Coleman, the semi-official history of the Congress, said that the survey filled a void and crackled with excitement. And it was also, of course, through survey that Walter formed his famous, celebrated partnership with Leo Labetz when he recruited Leo as associate editor and then eventually passed on the journal into Leo's hands. I think I should also say, though, that I think Walter's contribution to the Congress was not just intellectual, it was also political in a very critical sense. I know from correspondence with Melvin Lasky, for example, at the time of the revelations that the Congress had received covert funding from the Central Intelligence Agency through a series of intermediary foundations, the Congress, Lasky in particular, were very much besieged. And Walter wrote a very reassuring letter to Lasky at the time, frankly suggesting that he was being too persuaded by elite opinion, that nobody really takes a journal like Ramparts very seriously, and that the idea that anyone beyond Central Park takes the word of the New York Review of Books very seriously, in essence should see a psychiatrist. And I think this is significant because I know from conversations with Lasky that Walter was very much a touchstone for him in terms of, not only in terms of intellectual breadth, suggesting articles, suggesting contributors for the journals, but also frankly, as a kind of ballast, as it were, to many of the, to be frank, prima donnas who populated the upper echelons of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And Walter provided a very level-headed dismissal of the moral panic and the political vindictiveness that was evident at the time of the CIA revelations, and also frankly, a very personal solidarity to Lasky and others involved in Encounter at a time when their other friends, or fair weather friends, as it turned out, like Diana Trilling and Isaiah Berlin, were jumping ship. In terms of the lessons of the Congress, again, as Walter himself has said recently in his biography, he said the Congress offers a variety of lessons that will almost certainly be ignored. The true historian speaking there. I would venture a couple of lessons just to bring us up to the contemporary times. One is, we need to bear in mind that the Congress was formed by former Marxists, former communists, like Koestler, Huck, Lasky, Fisher et al. I think one of the lessons is it takes one to know one. These were people who knew the ideology, who knew the organizational tactics, who knew the political strategy of the communist movement, and were able to turn them against the ideological foe. For the same reason, as Walter noted in one of his celebrated epitaphs on Sovietology, it was, of course, the Mensheviks, or people from a Menshevik background who, during the Cold War, were not only the best informed, but also the most consistently correct in their political judgments. And I think there are lessons, contemporary lessons, that we can draw. We've heard earlier today about the fascist ideology, millenarian political movements, totalitarian religions. And I must say I was quite struck 2 weeks ago, on Friday, the huge demonstration in Tahrir Square in Cairo. And one of the young Facebook revolutionaries, so-called, who'd been behind the Tahrir Square demonstrations, the Google executive, was muscled off the stage by the bodyguards of Sheikh Qaradawi, who proceeded to address over 1 million worshippers, protesters, gathered in the square. And it reminded me of again, I went back to dig out a quote from Norman Cohn, the great historian of millenarian and utopian movements. And he reminded us that, quote, there does exist, he said, a subterranean world where pathological fantasies, disguised as ideas, are churned out by crooks and half-educated fanatics for the benefit of the ignorant and the superstitious. And before long, these fanatical ideologies become the official doctrine of the state. Of course, there are differences, radical differences in the ideological and political threat represented by Soviet communism on the one hand and radical or jihadist Islamism on the other. But I think there are compelling comparisons and contrasts. It's been argued since 9/11 by a number of commentators, most notably David Brooks, Anne Applebaum, Paul Behrman come to mind, that there is a need for a new Congress for Cultural Freedom, as they put it, to confront radical Islamism. And as I say, the contrasts are compelling. However, I think the contrasts are probably more instructive. The Cold War's ideological conflict was largely conducted between pro-Western on the one side and pro-Soviet or fellow traveling forces on the other, within institutions and movements located in the West, from labor unions to college campuses, that were relatively open to intellectuals and activists alike. It was an ideological conflict that was fought on largely secular, rationalist terrain. Both the Soviets and the West claimed to be the heirs of enlightenment, claimed to represent progress, claimed to represent rationality, claimed to represent progress and modernity. By contrast, the war of ideas against radical Islamism has to necessarily be fought out within Islam, between moderate Muslims, democratic Muslims, modernist Islam, and their radical jihadi Salafist counterparts. It also has to be fought out within the largely opaque and inaccessible mosques and movements of the Muslim world. Also, unlike the Cultural Cold War, it has to be fought out employing a largely theological discourse and confront varieties of Salafism that explicitly reject modernity. So in short, the actors, the agenda, and the terrain on which these respective ideological conflicts are being conducted differ considerably. And yet, there would still appear to be a role for a contemporary Laqueur, as it were, in following his example by analyzing and understanding the nature of the threat that is posed, in adapting the model of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, in disseminating analysis, in proposing policy responses, and in confronting those Western intellectuals, media commentators, and other opinion formers who take an overly, what you might call an overly accommodating, if not submissive, approach to the challenge that radical Islam presents, not only in the Arab world and the Muslim world, but also, not least, in Western Europe. And moreover, there is a role for promoting, developing practical initiatives of solidarity and support, which actively support those intellectuals, imams, dissidents, and other liberal modernist forces which are confronting radical Islam within Muslim communities. And again, as with the Cold War, we can see that there are now former jihadists, former radicals within the Islamic world who are taking the struggle, as it were, back into their communities. I'm thinking, for example, there's a British-based group called Quliam and an associated movement, Khudi, that operates in Pakistan, confronting radical Islamists on university campuses and rural villages across Pakistan. So although the analogy is not exact, it nevertheless, I think, remains instructive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it looks like we'll have time for discussion, questions. First thing to the organizer, it seems it's a very popular conference and we may need more chairs because people are coming and finding very few chairs. So I think it's a great success, but maybe after the break, which will be in half an hour, we'll get more chairs. I just want to add a few things because I see that there are, people who are possibly Walter Laqueur's contemporaries, are very young students. For those who didn't notice, Professor Laqueur is sitting here in the first row with Mrs. Laqueur. She's going to speak a few words later, so now the questions will be addressed to our panelists. For those who do not know and do not follow it, I just wanted to say that Professor Laqueur writes every day. He publishes, I would say almost every day, if not every week, in English, in German, in French, in Italian, in Russian, being translated in some other languages as well. And as we already heard from the speakers, he not only participates in discussions, he very often initiates them. I would say that if one was to describe certain writings of Professor Laqueur, it was that he was filling the vacuum. It was very clear that whenever there was no topic, he would fill the vacuum, and whenever then the people would follow, he would go to another topic, which I think explains partly why such a wide range of topics. The panelists really covered a lot of topics in which Walter Laqueur was the pioneer, but I think that the article on Finlandization was not mentioned. And I remember that in the 70s and 80s, the article from Commentary on Finlandization of Europe was one of those topics which really created a discussion about the future of Europe, about the Sovietization of Europe. And I think that his book, published a few years ago, The Last Days of Europe, although it's not that well known in the United States and it's not that much discussed here, in Europe is a constant subject of discussion, both because of what the speaker said, because he also goes and talks about the future, he predicts different trends. And the discussion about the last days of Europe is very much a discussion also about the multiculturalism of Europe. And somehow it's very interesting because in his normal life, Walter Laqueur is in a certain sense a multiculturalism. He's a man, I have never known anybody who is so familiar with so many cultures and who is able to write very often on the crossroad of many disciplines. It's history, but it's also anthropology, political science, ethnography. And I would say that, again, from what I was writing down when the speakers were mentioning different aspects, I would say that what maybe characterizes his writings, his research, is definitely empiricalism. I would say being merciless toward anything which is stupid. This is definitely a trait of Walter Laqueur. Very skeptical, very independent, and also I added counterintuitive. So now, please, let's start. Question, please tell whether it's a question, discussion. Yes, please. Do we need microphones for the speakers? Let's see.
Not for me. I have a big, loud voice.
Okay.
Thank you all. This was a wonderful beginning of this nice celebration of Walter Laqueur's contribution to intellectual and academic discourse. I have a comment and a question. The comment is just a slight defense of the New York Review of Books. It is read beyond Central Park. It's read widely in Eastern Europe. My mentor at Columbia, Ishmael, thinks that his articles in the New York Review of Books have a much greater impact than any of his scholars. So that's just my little comment. And he gives all his friends in Hungary the New York Review of Books as presents. Okay, but my question is very different. My question is one about cohort. Walter Laqueur, after all, was born in Germany, in Breslau, in 1920 or 21, depends when your birthday is, 21, thank you. And came to lived in several places. But it occurred to me that none of the speakers addressed an issue which is, to what extent was Walter Laqueur part of a cohort of analysts of fascism or of anti-Semitism or of the Holocaust, or of communism for that matter, that are German Jews who left Germany in 1938, 39, 40, or later, but basically in that period. And I'm thinking of people that many of you mentioned, George Mossig, Fritz Stern, who you didn't mention, but added, and others that don't need to be named. And the reason that this occurred to me is because once when I was reading about attitudes towards the role of Hitler in the Holocaust, between those who think he played little role, it was just the underlings, and those who thought he was central, that most of the people who thought he was central were Jews. Not all, not universally, obviously, but there was a kind of, so I was wondering if any of you might like to address the issue of Walter Laqueur's place in a cohort of scholars who were German Jews and their attitudes toward Jews.
Yes. Please, Professor Herf, you can hear.
Yeah, I'll be glad to do so. In my notes, I left out an important aspect of the book, The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism, which I should mention. And Walter there discusses the role of Islamism, and the role of anti-Semitism in its politics. But I'd like to make a point about an aspect of Walter Laqueur's published work and also his conversation. And that's a point about tone. I don't think Walter has ever said a fanatical thing in his life. And he's made an enormous contribution to the intellectual life of Washington, D.C. and the United States by saying things that sometimes are tough and are harsh, but not in a way that people can't hear them, and in a way that is open to conversation and open to debate. And there are not enough people in American intellectual life and in Washington who are able to do that. And I think one of the reasons that Walter became a prominent figure in Washington was that sense of balance, that willingness to listen, to look at different sides of an issue. And I think that's important to point out. The cohort issue that Marshall Rosenblatt rightly raises is an important one. And of course, Walter was very dear and friends with George Mossey. They founded the Journal of Contemporary History together, and they edited it together. And the editorial board of the Journal of Contemporary History is, I suppose, to use Tim Mason's term, a kind of intentionalist central. I mean, those who focused on the ideological dimensions of the Nazi regime, the role of anti-Semitism, of Hitler's perspective, were gathered in that journal. And one of the distinctive features of his career is that he not only focused on those dimensions of the Nazi regime, but as Michael Allen pointed out, he also took the ideology of the Soviet Union seriously, and then in more recent years took the ideology of the Islamists seriously. So if there's a methodological current that runs through this cohort, perhaps, it is a gut feeling that became a scholarly tradition about the role of ideas in history and their important their causal significance.
I might add to that one thing, that you can draw a kind of generational difference between the emigre German Jews in their approach to fascism. The older generation, the Frankfurt School, Marcuse, various people like that, had a very theoretical approach, which often confused as much as it clarified. It was the younger generation, the ones who really had been born toward the end of World War I and who were then educated during World War II and came on the scene after World War II, who took a much more empirical approach, a much more analytical approach, and really then made some of the major contributions to understanding fascism.
Okay. Would you like to add something?
Yes. I guess I obliquely mentioned the cohort in discussion of Generation Exodus, which is not just about the intellectual cohort, but a broader range of people who left Germany at that time. I do think there's something about direct perception of the climate of Nazi Germany that affected people. The feel of the situation, I think, was a great advantage for those people who went into a related scholarship. And it immunized them to some degree against the vagaries of academic fashion. They didn't think that they had to follow whatever was trendy because they had such a firm grounding in the original situation that they could simply develop their own thoughts and ideas. And Walter has been, from the beginning of his career, the independent thinker.
Yeah, let me just clarify on the New York Review of Books. Again, to clarify, I was paraphrasing Walter's comment at the time. In fact, and again, I didn't have the time to contextualize it, but this was at a time when Encounter, based in London, was being besieged. There were considerations about disbanding the magazine and so on because of the revelations in Ramparts, which had then also been picked up in the New York Times and the New York Review. And Walter was writing to Lasky to say, these journals do not represent mainstream American public opinion. They don't represent the political class. And to clarify, he says, as for the New York Review, it sometimes fulfills a useful function in publishing entertaining and amusing stuff. There was no such journal, and there is a need for it. But moral authority or political impact, it has neither. And in fact, it was the reference to Central Park was really, he goes on to say, the idea that the word of Susan Sontag or Jason Epstein carries any weight beyond Central Park is certainly untrue. So it was a point really about, you know, a European-based operation should not be unduly influenced by the intellectual elite, certain elements within the intellectual elite.
Maybe we could resolve the issue about the New York Review of Books by admitting that yes, Istvan Berg did write there, but he's not a typical author. He's a great author, but his articles usually provoke a lot of discussion. So let's maybe see whether you have other... Yes, please, sir. Maybe if you could... Can I ask you to come here so they could face Mr. Laqueur?
No.
Nice, no? No, okay.
It just takes too long.
I would like to make a comment on the subject of fascism. Before I do so, I would like to say I met Walter only relatively recently, considering the 90 years span of his life. In the last 10 years of it, while he was writing the book, The Generation Exodus, that you mentioned, and of which I am part. And in my many conversations with Walter, he has, more than any person I met, amazed me by his tremendous capacity to absorb material, critically analyze it, and come to very interesting and unique conclusions. That was my preface. Now, on the subject of fascism, and I must say I have not read Walter's book on fascism, so my remarks refer really to the talk, I think, by Professor Payne. National Socialism and fascism are usually completely lumped together, and I think that is partly due to the fact that the communists had done so because they viewed both of these systems as deadly enemies. In reality, while they had much in common, there were fundamental differences between fascism and National Socialism. The commonalities we all know, the dictatorship by one strong man, etc., and the ruthless conformism, etc. The major difference is that a fundamental tenet of National Socialism was racism, and particularly, of course, anti-Semitism. And more than just anti-Semitism, but the desire to eradicate the Jewish, quote, race, as they label it. There's
you have pointed out exactly why Walter would not give a single succinct definition of fascism in the 1996 book. Because what you raised is what is called the question of generic fascism. See, fascism as a broad political genus. And this debate began around 1930, before there was much scholarly inquiry into fascism. It still goes on. It's gone on, in fact, throughout Walter's long life. It's not over, and it will continue, because all serious scholars of fascism recognize fundamental differences. You pointed out one of the most important. There are others as well, between German National Socialism and Italian fascism. So this raises a fundamental question of definition and political taxonomy. Historians are essentially particularists. They emphasize the specific. And there are some historians who say, of course, the only fascist movement was the Italian National Fascist Party, because it called itself fascist. And in fact, none of the other so-called major fascist movements call themselves fascist, quote unquote. Unlike communist parties, nearly all of whom call themselves communist parties, or if not communist parties, some kind of adjectivized socialist party. So this is a fundamental question, and it depends really on, in a sense, what your scholarly strategy is. If you're interested in the specifics of history, the specifics of National Socialism, or the specifics of the, say, the Romanian Iron Guard, to take quite a different example, then the issue of generic fascism may become secondary. But the younger scholars more and more tend to work with a kind of framework of generic fascism, while recognizing that there are many more differences between different kinds of fascist movements compared with different communist movements. There are also some differences between various national communist movements and national communist regimes, but not nearly as much as in the case of the fascists. The idea revolves around what Ernst Nolte in 1964 first called the fascist minimum. Are there at least certain minimum common characteristics which should be common to all of the putative fascist movements? These have been identified, I think, convincingly by scholars. Others say, well, all right, that's true. All radical revolutionary movements have some things in common. Nonetheless, the differences are important, so some historians particularly agree with you and would prefer to really deal with the specificities of the national movements. So that the issue of generic fascism is kind of a political science approach. Are you looking for a taxonomic approach to modern radical politics which identifies certain kinds of movements that have certain things in common, even though individually they have other things which are different among themselves? Or do you want to leave this all merely individual and isolated and relatively free-floating? The tendency among scholars now, I think, is to work with a certain carefully delimited concept of generic fascism, while recognizing always from beginning to end this could not possibly be uniform among movements which, because nationalism is so important to them, differ enormously in their individual national characteristics.
Thank you, Professor Payne. Are there any questions? Okay.
Well,
no questions? We
well,
adjourn?
wait, I just wanted to bring I wanted to bring a few things to the attention of the audience. Stanley Payne has written a book on fascism in comparative perspective. Is that the title? Something like that?
The first one was Fascism, Comparison and Definition. The second was simply History.
Right, you're being too modest. Here today, we have two people in the audience who've dealt with Italian fascism a great deal. Michael Ledeen is in the back, and Charles Mayer has written a very important book, as you know, about the Historikerstreit and the methodological issues raised by thinking about uniqueness and comparison between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which came up in the dispute that began with Ernst Nolte's articles in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in the mid-1980s. The interesting thing about Fascism, A Reader's Guide, and Karl Bracher's essay in it on perspectives on Hitler or problems of interpretation or something like that, is that these issues of uniqueness and comparison in the 1970s were emerging in the context you present. That is, was a generalized concept of fascism appropriate, or did something, was it more appropriate to talk about distinctive features of German National Socialism? And so, again, that volume, in a way, in an interesting way that hasn't really been discussed a lot, prefigured some of the issues that came up in the historical strike, but in a very different way.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for all of the panelists and the discussants, and we have coffee, tea, and bagels.
So. Our work is done. Have you ever done that? Printed out an essay that you thought was like just printed out the wrong essay?
I've done that for a class.
You've done that for a class.
Kind of funny.
You know, I was tired. It was like 11:30 at night. Just, you know, print. You know. Oh, great! There it is.